The hum of the engines was steady. That kind of hum that settles deep in your bones when you are 30,000 feet above the clouds. Rows of soft, white lights curved along the ceiling of the first-class cabin. Polished chrome gleamed. Crystal glasses clinked. Conversations rose and fell like waves. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with the faint aroma of champagne and warm towels. It was a place designed for quiet, for people who paid for peace, and then, cutting through that peace like thunder splitting a calm sky, came a sound no one could ignore. A cry, high, sharp, relentless, a baby's cry. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. The sound came from seat 1A, where a young woman sat holding a baby no more than a few months old. Her designer blouse was wrinkled, her hair slightly out of place, her face pale with exhaustion. Tears of her own gathered behind her eyes, though she tried to hide them. The baby screamed again, a sound so full of raw need that it filled the entire cabin. A man in a navy suit lowered his newspaper and sighed loudly. A woman across the aisle pressed her fingers to her temples, and a flight attendant, elegant, trained, polite, appeared almost instantly. "Ma'am," she said softly, "is everything all right?" The young mother's voice trembled. "I do not know what is wrong. She has been crying since we took off. She will not stop." Her words carried an accent, soft, European, and her eyes darted around as if searching for permission to exist. Passengers exchanged looks, some sympathetic, most impatient. The flight attendant leaned closer, whispering, "Would you like me to bring something? Warm milk? A blanket?" But before the woman could answer, a voice came from the back of the cabin, deep, commanding, tired of waiting. "Can someone handle that noise?" Every head turned again. The voice belonged to James Whitmore, a billionaire investor, the kind whose face had graced magazines and talk shows. His tailored gray suit cost more than most people's monthly rent. His watch sparkled like cold glass under the cabin lights. He did not shout. He did not need to. His tone carried the weight of expectation, the kind that made people obey before thinking. The mother froze. "I am sorry," she whispered, bouncing the baby gently in her arms. "She will stop soon, I promise." But the baby only screamed louder, the sound cutting through her apology like a blade. James sighed again, this time louder, closing his laptop with deliberate irritation. "I paid for a first-class seat, not a daycare." The words hung in the air like a slap. The mother's face flushed red. She turned away, whispering to the baby, rocking her, whispering again, "Please, please, stop, my angel, please." The passengers tried to pretend they were not watching, but their glances betrayed them. Some hid behind magazines. Others tilted their heads toward the scene. And in the very back row of first class, near the curtain that separated wealth from the rest of the plane, sat an elderly woman. Her skin was deep and beautiful, like polished mahogany. Her hair, a crown of silver curls, was wrapped in a soft patterned scarf. Her hands rested on her lap, folded gently over a worn leather purse. She had boarded quietly, unnoticed. No designer luggage. No glittering jewelry. Only a calm presence that seemed too pure for a place this cold. As the baby's cries grew louder, she slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, kind, tired, but sharp, took in the scene that the mother's trembling hands. The billionaire's impatience, the way the flight attendants kept smiling to keep their jobs, and she sighed. Not in annoyance, but in understanding. She had heard cries like that before, not just from babies, but from souls too small to carry their own pain. The engines roared softly beneath her feet. The clouds rolled endlessly outside the window. The plane kept flying forward, indifferent to the discomfort inside it. The baby's sobs turned to hiccups, then back to cries again. The young mother whispered to no one, "Please, God, help me." And that was when the elderly woman unbuckled her seat belt. Slowly, gracefully, every eye followed her as she stood. She didn't rush. She didn't look around for permission. She simply began to walk down the aisle, her steps slow, steady, and sure. The billionaire frowned, muttering under his breath. The flight attendant tried to intercept her. "Ma'am, please, the seatbelt sign. But the old woman raised a hand. Gently, and the flight attendant froze as if the gesture carried something sacred. Kesha, that was the old woman's name, didn't speak as she stopped beside the trembling mother. Young woman looked up in surprise. The baby screamed again. And then Kesha smiled, a small, knowing smile that came from somewhere far older than time. May I hold her? She asked softly. The young mother hesitated. Her lips parted, unsure. She does not stop for anyone. Kesha's eyes twinkled. Maybe she just has not met the right arms yet. The mother blinked. For a moment, the whole plane seemed to hold its breath. Then she nodded. Slowly, carefully, she handed her child, her crying, red-faced, trembling child, into the arms of a stranger. And Kesha did the unthinkable. She began to sing, not loud, not showy, a low, gentle hum that wrapped around the baby like a blanket. The sound wasn't English, nor any language the passengers could name. It was older, something from another time, another world. Within seconds, the baby's cries softened, her tiny fists unclenched, her breathing slowed, and in less than a minute, she was asleep. The entire cabin went silent. The billionaire stared. The mother covered her mouth with trembling fingers, and for the first time since takeoff, peace returned. Kesha smiled down at the child, rocking her gently, whispering words only a grandmother's heart would know. She was never the problem, she murmured. She just needed to be heard. For a long moment, the world inside that airplane forgot how to move. The baby, who had filled every corner of the cabin with her cries, now slept soundly against the shoulder of a stranger. Her tiny chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm. Her little hand clutched the edge of the old woman's scarf, fingers twitching softly as if still holding onto a dream. And Kesha, the elderly woman, sat quietly, humming under her breath, a tune that sounded like sunlight through stained glass. The passengers who had once sighed, rolled their eyes, and muttered under their breath, now sat still. The tension that had filled the cabin had melted into something else. Or no one could explain it. No one dared to. The young mother, her eyes wide, wet with disbelief, sat frozen for a few seconds, as if she might wake up and find it had all been a dream. Then, with a shaky exhale, she whispered, "How did you do that?" Kesha smiled faintly, still rocking the baby. "Children do not always cry because they are hungry," she said softly. "Sometimes, they cry because they can feel what their mothers are feeling." The young woman blinked, confused. "Feel what I feel?" "Yes," Kesha whispered. "You are scared. She feels that. You are lonely. She feels that too. But when someone holds her with peace inside them," she smiled again, looking down at the now sleeping baby, "she learns that the world is safe again." The mother's eyes filled with tears. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "I have not slept in 3 days. I am trying so hard." "I know," Kesha said gently. "You do not need to try so hard to be perfect. Just to be present." The woman covered her mouth with her trembling hand, shoulders shaking. Kesha leaned forward, whispering something that only she could hear. Words not of pity, but of comfort. From across the aisle, the billionaire watched the scene unfold with a face he could not recognize his own. James Whitmore had never been the type to apologize. He had built a life on control. He bought silence with money, respect with fear, and peace with distance. The idea that something so simple, a song, a touch, a stranger, could do what his wealth never could, unsettled him. He looked down at his watch, a diamond-faced statement of success, but it felt meaningless now. The flight attendant, still frozen halfway down the aisle, slowly regained her composure. She smiled awkwardly and said, "Would anyone like something to drink?" But no one answered. Not yet. Kesha's humming drifted through the air, again low, soft, ancient. The clouds outside were beginning to turn gold as the plane moved through late afternoon skies. Shafts of sunlight cut through the windows, resting on the baby's face like gentle blessings. For once, even the engines seemed quieter. James turned his gaze toward the window, trying to make sense of the strange heaviness in his chest. He had spent years avoiding such feelings, burying them under contracts, investments, and first-class flights. But something about this woman, this ordinary, kind, poor woman, was undoing him one breath at a time. He looked at her hands, old, wrinkled, veined, but they held the baby with a steadiness money could never buy. He found himself whispering before he even realized it. "How?" Kesha looked up, her eyes meeting his. "How? What?" He hesitated. "How did you make her stop crying?" Her eyes softened. "I did not make her stop. I reminded her she was safe." The words struck deeper than he expected. He cleared his throat and looked away, pretending to be interested in the clouds again. But inside, something cracked. A quiet shame, a recognition of the emptiness that money had never filled. Time moved differently now. Passengers began whispering softly, not the irritated kind of whispers that slice through air, but gentle ones, reverent ones. Someone took a photo. Someone else quietly deleted the angry message. They had been composing earlier about babies in first class. The mother closed her eyes, resting her head back for the first time in hours. The tension in her body melted away. She looked at Kesha and whispered, "You are an angel." Kesha chuckled softly. "No, my dear, I am just a woman who remembers what crying sounds like when no one listens." Her words carried a weight that even silence respected. The flight attendant approached, her voice tender. "Would you like me to bring you something, ma'am?" Kesha shook her head. "No, dear, just some water for the mother." The attendant smiled, tears pricking her eyes. Of course, when the flight landed hours later, the baby was still asleep, peaceful, unbothered, wrapped in Kesha's shawl. As passengers began gathering their things, James Whitmore lingered, pretending to check his phone, though he had no messages. The mother, now calmer, turned to Kesha. "I do not know how to thank you." Kesha handed the baby back gently, careful not to wake her. "Thank her," she said, nodding at the child, "for reminding everyone here that even innocence can be powerful enough to humble pride." James flinched slightly. He knew the words weren't aimed at him directly, but they landed where they needed to. The young woman clutched her baby close, tears falling freely now. "May I ask your name?" Kesha smiled. "You may. But names do not matter as much as kindness. Remember that." As the plane taxied to the gate, Kesha gathered her simple purse and stood. The passengers watched her, not with pity, not with judgment, but with a kind of reverence. The billionaire found himself standing too, unsure what to say. For a man who always had the right words, he suddenly had none. When she passed his seat, he managed to speak. "Ma'am," he began. Kesha stopped and turned toward him. He swallowed. "I was rude earlier. I should not have said what I did." Her eyes held his, soft but unyielding. "You are not the first man to forget that patience is worth more than money." He lowered his gaze. "You are right." Kesha nodded once, then smiled, not to embarrass him, but to free him from his own guilt. "Have a good evening, Mr. Whitmore." He blinked. "You know my name?" She chuckled quietly. "Everyone knows the names of those who are rich, but only a few will remember the ones who are kind." And with that, she turned and walked toward the exit. As James watched her disappear into the crowd, something stirred deep inside him, something he had not felt in years. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't guilt. It was the ache of recognition that for all his wealth, all his control, he had never truly learned how to hold something with care. The engines cooled, the passengers disembarked. The cabin emptied. But for James Whitmore, the sound of that baby's cry, and the peace that followed, would echo long after he touched the ground. The terminal was alive with noise. Announcements echoed. Wheels of luggage rolled in every direction. Phones rang, children laughed, and somewhere near the gates, the faint smell of coffee drifted through the air. But amid all that movement, one man stood still. James Whitmore, billionaire, mogul, and self-proclaimed master of control, stood by the glass wall of the arrivals hall, and for the first time in a long time, he did not know where to go. Outside, rain tapped gently against the glass, streaking the city lights into soft lines, Passengers hurried past him, their reflections blurring together like ghosts of another world, yet all he could see, all his mind replayed, was that quiet woman's face, the sound of her song. The peace she carried. The way an entire cabin of strangers had fallen silent, not because of wealth or authority, but because of grace. He closed his eyes, and in the hum of the airport, he could still hear the baby's cries fading into calm. It was strange how that moment, something so small, so human, had cracked open the walls he'd built around his own heart. A voice broke through his thoughts. Mr. Whitmore. He turned. His driver stood a few feet away, holding an umbrella and his briefcase. Your car is ready, sir. James nodded, but his gaze drifted toward the crowd spilling out from the gate. Among them, he saw her. Kesha. The elderly woman walked slowly, her shawl gathered close against her shoulders. Her shoes were worn, her pace steady but unhurried. She carried no luggage except her small leather purse, and still, there was something regal about her. He hesitated just for a moment, then stepped forward. Excuse me. Kesha turned, her expression calm, her eyes carrying that same quiet kindness that had silenced a plane full of impatience. Mr. Whitmore, she said gently, as if she had expected him. He blinked. You remember me? I remember people, she replied. Not their mistakes. Her words disarmed him. I wanted to thank you, he said, not just for calming the child, but for reminding me of something I had forgotten. She smiled softly. And what is that, sir? That peace, he said slowly, cannot be purchased. Kesha nodded. It cannot be bought, but it can be shared. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the terminal moved around them like a tide, but their small conversation stayed still, like an island untouched by the storm. James looked down at the floor, suddenly uncertain. Would you allow me to offer you a ride? It is the least I can do. She shook her head kindly. No, child. I do not need a ride. Please, he insisted. It would be an honor. Kesha chuckled softly, the sound like a low hum of wind through leaves. You are not used to being told no, are you? He smiled, embarrassed. Not often. She tilted her head, studying him. Then maybe this is the first lesson that costs you nothing. He laughed quietly, not the polished laugh that made business partners comfortable, but something lighter, freer. Still, he hesitated. At least let me walk you to the curb. Kesha nodded once. If you wish. The automatic doors slid open, and the city greeted them with cool rain and 1,000 headlights. Kesha stepped beneath the overhang, the rain catching faint silver streaks in her hair. Her bus arrived, old, faded blue engine, coughing softly. James frowned. You take the bus? She smiled. Yes. The same way I took it to the airport, and the same way I will take it home. He hesitated. Where is home, if I may ask? She looked out at the rain. A small apartment 2 blocks from the church on Oak Street. Nothing fancy, but the neighbors are kind, and the walls are full of prayers. James glanced back at his black luxury car idling behind them, tinted windows, polished chrome. He looked again at the bus, dented, slow, carrying people who looked tired but content. He had never envied another man's ride before, until now. Before she stepped onto the bus, Kesha turned to him. You have a good heart, Mr. Whitmore. You just buried it under too many zeros. He met her gaze, speechless. Find a reason to use it again, she said softly. Not to make more money, but to make something grow. The bus door opened with a hiss. Kesha took one step up, then paused. Do you have children? He hesitated. No, my wife passed away a few years ago. We wanted one, but work always came first. Kesha nodded slowly. Then maybe that is why God put that crying baby on your plane, to remind you what a real purpose sounds like. Before he could reply, she smiled. That same calm, knowing smile, and stepped onto the bus. The doors closed. The bus pulled away, and for the first time in his life, James Whitmore stood in the rain without rushing to escape it. Later that night, he sat in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city. The view was breathtaking. Endless lights. Skyscrapers piercing the clouds. Cars threading through streets like veins of gold. But the silence felt heavy. He poured himself a glass of wine, but it didn't help. He turned on music, but it sounded hollow. Finally, he sat at his grand piano, untouched for years. His wife used to play, her laughter echoing through this same room. Now it was just him, his reflection in the polished black surface, and the faint hum of the city below. He touched a single key softly, and the note hung in the air like a memory. The baby's cry came back to him. Then the song that silenced it. He began to hum, quietly, hesitantly, the same tune. Kesha had sung. It was clumsy at first, wrong notes, uneven rhythm, but soon, something inside him began to loosen. For the first time in years, he felt human again. When he woke the next morning, sunlight had filled the room. He walked to the window, coffee in hand, and looked down at the city. The world seemed softer. He opened his email and scrolled past contracts, investment reports, and financial updates, none of which seemed urgent anymore. Then his eyes caught a small notification, a local fundraiser for St. Mary's Community Shelter, located near Oak Street. He stared at the address. Oak Street, he smiled. So that is where you live, Kesha, he whispered. And for the first time in his life, James Whitmore made a decision, not guided by profit. The morning was grey, heavy with the kind of rain that made the world look like an oil painting, muted, softened, full of depth. James Whitmore stood at the window of his penthouse apartment, looking down at the city below. The skyline stretched for miles, but in his chest, there was only one thought. Oak Street. That was where Kesha lived. The same street that had been tucked away behind luxury stores, where every corner felt like a turn away from the life he had built. And yet, for the first time in his life, James found himself longing to walk that street, to see the world not from his vantage point in the clouds, but from the ground. He grabbed his coat, slung it over his shoulder, and headed toward the elevator. The doorman gave him a quick nod as he passed. There were no meetings today. Number investors calling to check in. No gala invitations to ignore. Today. It was just him and the world that had always been hidden from view. The shelter on Oak Street wasn't far, but the drive felt longer than it should have. James sat in the back of his sleek black car. The windows rolled down just enough to catch the scent of fresh rain. He could still feel the softness of Kesha's voice in his ear, still hear her words about peace, about how easy it is to forget the simple truths when your life is too busy to listen. As the car turned onto Oak Street, he saw the difference in the buildings immediately. The luxury skyscrapers that dotted the rest of the city gave way to smaller, older buildings, faded paint, peeling signage. The streets were crowded with families, children chasing one another between puddles, older men sitting on stoops exchanging stories. There were no glass facades here, no polished marble. Everything was worn but well-loved. James noticed a sign on the corner, St. Mary's Community Shelter. It was a modest building, 3 stories tall, with a simple brick facade. The windows were clean but small, the door unassuming. There were no grand entrances, no shiny floors, just a place that looked like it had seen more than its fair share of struggles, and yet, still stood proudly in the rain. He stepped out of the car and was immediately greeted by a man wearing a worn jacket and a smile that seemed to stretch across his entire face. "Good morning, sir. You here to visit?" James nodded, unsure of what to expect. "Yes, I'm here to see Kesha Williams." The man's face softened slightly. "Ah, you must be the billionaire." He smiled kindly. "She told us about you." James blinked, feeling a shift in the air. He wasn't used to being talked about so casually. He had always been the one doing the talking. He stammered for a moment. "Yes, I met her on the plane. Come on in, Mr. Whitmore, she's expecting you." The door opened with a gentle creak, and James stepped inside. The shelter was warm, filled with the sounds of people moving through their day. There were no high-tech gadgets here, no pristine floors or marble counters. Just people. The hallway was lined with photos of volunteers, families, and children. and each photo had a small nameplate beneath it, caring for the community. James felt out of place, not because of the people, but because of the feeling that surrounded him. There was a quiet calm here, a peace that seemed to flow through the air. It wasn't the kind of peace that came with wealth. It wasn't the peace of isolation or detachment. It was something deeper, something built by every hand that helped Dot as he walked through the hallway. He saw people preparing food in the small kitchen, children coloring at a table, and staff members walking by with folders in hand, checking in on the community members. It wasn't luxury, but it was life. Kesha appeared from around the corner, her silver curls wrapped in the same patterned scarf he'd seen on the plane. She was carrying a small pot of soup in her hands, a smile on her face. "Mr. Whitmore," she said warmly, "I wasn't expecting you so soon." She was different here, he realized. She was more present, more grounded, as though she belonged to this place in a way that even her calmness couldn't explain. "Thank you for letting me come," he said, his voice soft. "I wanted to see this place for myself." She smiled. "I told you I live here, didn't I? There's a lot of good in the world, James, but you'll only find it when you're willing to look." James took a deep breath. As if letting go of something he hadn't known he was holding, Kesha led him through the shelter, showing him the rooms where families stayed, the children's play area, and the small library that sat at the back of the building. Every corner was filled with purpose. Even the worn carpets felt loved. "I didn't come here to ask for money," she said, as they passed by the library. "I came here to give, to show people that kindness is worth more than wealth." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into his chest. "I don't know how to fix everything," he admitted. "I've spent my life building walls, not bridges." Kesha turned toward him, her eyes steady. "Sometimes, all it takes is to tear one wall down. That's how change begins." By the time he left the shelter, James felt like a different man. The air outside didn't seem so cold. The rain had stopped, leaving only the scent of damp earth in the air. But more than the weather, something had changed inside him. He had spent his entire life living in spaces that were designed to keep people out. But in that small shelter, he had witnessed something that money couldn't buy: connection, community, a shared humanity. Before he got into his car, he turned to the man who had greeted him earlier. "Can you tell me more about the shelter's work? How do you help the people here?" The man smiled, clearly pleased. "We provide food, shelter, counseling, and job training. But more than that, we provide dignity. The ability to feel seen again. Kesha's a big part of that. She's been here for years, helping others without asking for anything in return." James paused, thinking about how much he'd taken for granted: his wealth, his power, his reputation. He thought about the people he'd ignored, the walls he'd built around himself. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I think I need to do more than just donate money." The man looked at him with knowing eyes. "You've already started, and that's all it takes." That evening, back at his penthouse, James sat down at his desk, his laptop open in front of him. The city outside was quiet, but his mind was racing. He typed one sentence into his email: "I would like to offer my support to St. Mary's Community Shelter, starting with a donation for their upcoming programs." But then he paused. Hands hovering over the keyboard, he deleted the line. Instead, he wrote, "I want to help fund new programs for the homeless and disenfranchised in our city. I want to ensure they have the same opportunities as anyone else. We need to invest in humanity, not just buildings." He clicked send. The email wasn't the end. It was the first step. And for the first time in his life, James Whitmore felt like he was walking in the right direction. The days following his visit to St. Mary's Shelter felt like a soft awakening for James Whitmore. The world he had lived in, the one filled with glass towers and executive boardrooms, polished suits and cold contracts, began to feel distant. Almost unreal. At first, it was small things. The way he started walking to work instead of taking the car. The way he stopped checking his phone every few seconds, allowing himself to think instead of react. The way he caught himself pausing at street corners, watching people cross the street without rushing, without agendas, But none of that felt as powerful as what happened when he returned to St. Mary's a week later. The shelter had no grand entrance, no marble floors or gold-trimmed doors. But when James stepped inside that afternoon, it felt like walking into something tangible, something real. The buzz of the shelter had become routine. Staff moving in and out of rooms, children laughing in the playroom, volunteers preparing meals in the kitchen. But today, there was an energy that vibrated in the air, like a shared breath being held. Kesha was in the back, talking to a group of young mothers about childcare. As soon as she saw him, her face softened, a small smile forming. "James," she said with that same warmth. "I didn't expect to see you so soon." He nodded, trying to conceal the feeling in his chest. I needed to come back." Her eyes sparkled knowingly. "You did more than that," she replied softly. "You're already here. That's enough." But he wasn't just here. He had something to offer, something he hadn't realized he could give. James had arranged for a sizable donation, but it wasn't just money. He had spoken to a few colleagues, and together they had arranged to fund several new programs for the shelter job training, mental health support, and an after-school tutoring center for children. It was all coming together faster than he had anticipated. The shelter's kitchen was now filled with warm food being prepped for a large dinner. And as the volunteer coordinator handed him an apron, he realized something he hadn't expected. He was about to cook. Kesha watched him closely, her arms crossed with that knowing smile. "You'll do fine." James chuckled nervously, picking up a knife. "I'm not sure I've ever chopped vegetables before." "Then it's about time you learned," Kesha teased gently. For the next hour, they worked side by side, the rhythmic chopping of carrots and onions filling the quiet space. James found himself losing track of time. There was something grounding about the work, something real and human. They didn't talk much while they worked, but there was an understanding between them, an unspoken connection. "I'm sorry," James said quietly, his hands still chopping. "For everything I've missed. For how much I've ignored." Kesha paused, her hands stilling in the flour. "The past is something we can't change, James, but what you're doing right now, that's where change starts." By the time dinner was ready, the shelter had filled with people, children with laughter in their eyes, families who had found a moment of peace, and volunteers who worked with kindness in their hearts. James sat at a table, surrounded by people who didn't care who he was or what he had done. They just cared that he was there. Kesha joined him, sitting across the table. And for the first time, James realized how much of himself he had left behind in his pursuit of success. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice still carrying the weight of his realization. "How did you know this was the right thing to do?" Kesha smiled, picking up a piece of bread. "I didn't know, James, but I knew I couldn't keep waiting for someone else to fix things." James looked at her, her calm presence surrounding him like a quiet force. "You've always known," she shrugged, her gaze steady. "I've always known that change doesn't come from waiting. It comes from what you're willing to give. It comes from understanding that your power is in your actions, not in your name or your status." By the end of the evening, James knew what he had to do. He didn't need to wait for another perfect moment. He didn't need to consult more people or get more approval. He didn't need to keep holding on to the things that weighed him down. He had already made the choice. The next morning, James Whitmore called his assistant. "I need a meeting set up with the mayor. I want to talk about homelessness, about how we can partner with local shelters, and what we can do for people who need more than just a handout." His assistant hesitated. "Sir, are you sure this is what you want to prioritize? You've got meetings with investors this week, I'm sure," James said, his voice clear and decisive. "This is important. Set the meeting for tomorrow." He hung up, then picked up his phone to send a message to Kesha. "I'm going to do more than donate money. I want to bring real change to this city, and I want you to help me make it happen." He hit send. The next few weeks felt like a blur of new beginnings. Meetings with the mayor, with city officials, with other local organizations. Each conversation felt like another layer of the truth being uncovered. James had begun to see the world through a different lens, a lens that no longer prioritized power, but compassion. No longer wealth, but humanity. And through it all, Kesha was there quietly guiding him, not with words, but with actions. She didn't need to tell him how to live. She simply showed him. On the night of the city's annual charity gala, James stood in front of hundreds of people, some familiar, some new, holding his glass of champagne, feeling the weight of everything he had learned. This time, he wasn't just the face of a corporation. He wasn't just the man with the power to write checks and make decisions. He was the man who had finally understood what it meant to give. Kesha walked up beside him, her silver curls catching the soft light from the chandeliers above. Her eyes sparkled with quiet pride. "So, this is where we start." James looked around the room, his voice low. "This is where we change it." She nodded, as though the answer had always been there. "It's about showing up. It's about being here for each other." And in that moment, surrounded by the city's elite, James Whitmore knew what it felt like to truly belong. The morning James Whitmore decided to make the call was the same morning the sky had turned to silver. He woke up early, the remnants of sleep still heavy in his eyes, but his mind was clear. The lessons he had learned in the past week's lessons Kesha had taught him had settled in like truth that refuses to leave. He poured himself a glass of water and stared out the window at the city skyline. The view that once seemed like the epitome of success now felt like a cage he had built around himself. Every building, every business deal, every piece of luxury he owned had been a goal achieved, but it hadn't been enough. What had it been for? He couldn't answer. Kesha had showed him that peace and fulfillment couldn't be bought, not with the millions he had, not with the influence he wielded. What he had been searching for had never been in his bank account. It had always been in the relationships, in the simple moments where people treated each other like human beings, not transactions. And now, it was time to change. Not just for him, but for others who had never had the chance to do what he'd done, look beyond the surface. James didn't wait. By 8:30 a.m., his assistant was pulling together a meeting with the mayor, the local council, and a few heads of charitable organizations. Kesha, naturally, was already involved. Her unwavering belief that a community could be strengthened with the right support had led her to connect with others who shared her vision. The shelter on Oak Street had been the heart of their work, but now it was time to scale it. The homeless, the hungry, the disenfranchised, they all needed not just help, but a chance. James had offered financial support. Yes, he had set up a donation fund. But now, he was going a step further. He was using his influence, his connections, to shift the narrative around the city's approach to poverty. It wasn't about handouts. It was about uplift. That afternoon, in a small conference room in City Hall, James sat at the table with the Mayor Kesha and a few local council members. The room buzzed with energy, but not the usual political energy. This was something different, something quieter. The mayor had been an ally in word only, but James wasn't fooled. He knew that real change didn't come from making empty promises. It came from those who were willing to push boundaries, to ask the hard questions, and to challenge the status quo. He turned to Kesha. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice carrying a new sense of purpose. "About what you said the other day. About investing in people." She nodded, her gaze steady. "It's not just about buildings or resources, James. It's about the lives that fill those spaces, the families that are so often ignored by the system." James turned to the mayor. "I want to set up a fund, a proper fund for displaced families, job training, and emergency housing. This city has over 1 million people, but it's not built for all of them. It's built for a few." The mayor stiffened. "That's an ambitious project. We've tried initiatives like this before, James. They always fall apart." "Then it's time we make them stick," James said firmly. "I've seen the impact St. Mary's has on the community. I've seen Kesha's work. If we can make these services available to everyone who needs them, we can change the landscape of this city." The mayor exhaled slowly, his eyes flicking to Kesha before resting back on James. "And what exactly do you propose?" James leaned forward. "We use the money from the new development taxes, allocate it directly to community programs like the shelter, expand resources for the homeless, and put a heavy focus on long-term solutions like mental health and job training. I'll match funds and help build connections. But we need to make this sustainable. Kesha's voice was calm, but full of conviction. If we keep pushing this idea, James, it will take hold. But it's not just about the money. It's about giving people the power to stand up and walk forward. The mayor remained quiet for a moment. Then, he sighed. Defeated, but thoughtful. All right, James. If you're serious, I'm in. But you'll have to take the lead. I'll back you. But this is on your shoulders. James's heart raced. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. But this time, it wasn't about his wealth or status. It was about the potential for change. The power to help people stand. That evening, after the meeting had ended, James drove alone through the city streets. It was a grey day, and the wet roads reflected the city's lights in fractured patterns. The world felt in between, still unsure of itself. Still clinging to old habits. He passed Oak Street again, but this time, something was different. The buildings felt alive, not because they were taller or shinier, but because there was a spark of possibility in the air. The shelter stood at the corner, its old brick walls almost glowing in the soft evening light. A few children ran past the steps, laughing, kicking a ball. The lights inside flickered through the windows. Warm and welcoming, James slowed his car and stopped in front of the shelter. He didn't need to get out. He didn't need to ask for permission. He just needed to be there. A few seconds passed. Then he got out of the car. Kesha was right. It was time to take the first step toward real change. Not tomorrow, not in a year, but now. Right here, in front of a place that had been holding the city's heart all along. A few weeks later, the first community center funded by James's initiative opened its doors. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was a low-key event, filled with the people who needed it most. Local leaders stood beside the homeless, the mothers, the children, as well as the volunteers who had worked tirelessly for months. James stood on the stage, smiling as the crowd cheered. But his gaze drifted to Kesha. She stood near the back, her eyes glowing with quiet pride. This wasn't just his win. This was theirs. Kesha walked up to him after the ceremony, her silver curls catching the sunlight. You did good, James. He smiled, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. I didn't do it alone, Kesha. I've learned something from you, something that'll stay with me forever. Kesha smiled softly. I think you're starting to understand. Change is a choice. But it's a choice you have to make every day. James nodded. And I'm ready. He looked out over the crowd, at the people whose lives were about to change because they were seen. Because someone had finally decided to make them a priority. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It wasn't just a program. It was a foundation. That evening, after the event, James found himself standing alone in the same room where he had first met Kesha. The lights were dim. The floor empty, but the echoes of the day still buzzed in the air. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing anything. He wasn't trying to buy peace. He wasn't looking for the next deal. He had found what he needed, not through wealth or power, but through connection, through people. As he looked around the room, he whispered to himself, this is only the beginning. And it was. The city felt different in the morning light, not because it had changed, but because James Whitmore had. He stood by the windows of his penthouse apartment, staring out over the skyline that had once seemed like his entire world. Now, it felt distant. A shadow of the real world he had only just begun to understand. The glass towers, the luxury cars, the polished boardrooms, all of it seemed like a game that had no real stakes. Down below, people moved through their lives with their own concerns, their own stories, their own struggles, and for the first time in a long while, James didn't feel like he was above them. He felt like part of them. The initiative he had launched to support the homeless and disenfranchised had taken off in ways he hadn't expected. St. Mary's Shelter was no longer just a small community center. It was now a beacon for change, and the programs they had set up were starting to show real results. Families had found housing, people had found jobs, children were getting the education they deserved, and, most importantly, lives were being rebuilt. But even more than the tangible outcomes, it was the people who had begun to shift their mindset. The way the community had started to care for one another, to lift each other up, was the true measure of success. And at the heart of it all was Kesha Williams. Her steady presence had been the anchor, the reminder that true change comes not from the top down, but from the people at the bottom, the ones who never gave up. Even when the system made them invisible, Kesha had not only shown him how to give, she had shown him how to live. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when James decided it was time to meet her again. He hadn't told her he was coming. He wasn't sure if it would be appropriate. After all, he had done what he could, funded the projects, lent his name, and made sure the initiative was sustainable. But Kesha had never asked for any of that. She had never needed a billionaire's charity. She needed action. And he had provided it, but it was more than just the funds. It was the understanding that had grown between them. James stepped out of his penthouse and into the elevator, his mind buzzing. He wasn't sure what he was going to say when he saw her again. But he knew it was time. St. Mary's shelter had expanded since he had last been there. The new programs had drawn more families and volunteers. The building, though modest, felt warm. It had that unique energy that came from real human connection, the kind that you couldn't buy but only earn through time and effort. He walked through the door and immediately noticed the difference. People were moving around with purpose. Volunteers were organizing donations, staff members were busy preparing meals, and children played in the corner, their laughter filling the air. Kesha was at the center of it all, her face still calm, but there was a quiet pride in her eyes as she watched the community thrive. James took a deep breath and approached her. She saw him before he could speak and raised an eyebrow. "Well, look who decided to show up," she said, with a small smile, as if she had been expecting him all along. I wanted to thank you," James began, unsure of how to say what he needed to, "for everything, for showing me what I was missing, for showing me that wealth means nothing if you're not using it to create real change." Kesha nodded slowly. "You've done more than most ever will, James. But it's not about the money. It's about the willingness to change." He took a step closer. "And you've been the one teaching me how to do that." Kesha smiled, but this time there was a twinkle in her eyes. "Well, someone had to. You were a little too busy running the world to see it." James laughed softly. "I guess I was. But I'm here now, and I'm ready to listen." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "Then listen. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't just fund the project. Be the change. Lead by example." Over the next few months, James did exactly that. He didn't just write checks or make speeches, he got involved. He worked alongside Kesha at the shelter. He spent his evenings packing food, organizing drives, and attending community meetings. It wasn't always glamorous, and it was often exhausting. But for the first time in his life, James felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. He began to connect with the people he had once overlooked. He listened to their stories, shared their burdens, and realized that the true value of wealth wasn't in hoarding it, but in using it to create opportunities. Kesha was right. The change they were creating wasn't about charity. It was about equity. One afternoon, as they sat together in the shelter's newly renovated library, Kesha looked at James and said, "You've come a long way. Mr. Whitmore, I'm proud of you." He smiled, his heart warm. "I've learned a lot from you, Kesha, and I think the real lesson is that peace isn't something you find, it's something you make." Kesha chuckled softly. "I'll take that as a compliment." "I mean it," he replied. "I've spent my entire life trying to control things, to buy solutions. But you've shown me that the real solution is in people, in their stories, their struggles, their willingness to rise together." Her eyes softened, and she reached for his hand. "You've learned what most never will. You've learned to see people, not as problems to fix, but as partners to lift." James squeezed her hand gently, grateful. "I still have a lot to learn," Kesha smiled. "We all do. But the difference is that you're listening now. And that's enough to change the world." A year later, the shelter's programs were fully funded and thriving. St. Mary's, was now a central hub for the city's homeless community. And James had helped turn it into a model of success. More cities were reaching out, eager to replicate what they had started here. But for James, the greatest success wasn't in the headlines or the accolades. It was in the way he had become a part of something greater than himself. Kesha's quiet leadership had transformed him. And in return, he had helped transform an entire community. Together, they had shown that change didn't come from wealth or power. It came from the willingness to be present, to listen, to care, and to act. As James stood outside the shelter one evening, watching the sunset turn the sky into streaks of gold and orange, he felt the weight of everything he had gained, not in money, but in purpose. And as Kesha walked toward him, her smile warm, her eyes full of pride, he knew that this was only the beginning. "Ready for the next chapter?" she asked, her voice gentle. James nodded, the weight of responsibility settling comfortably on his shoulders. "I am." And for the first time in his life, he was certain that he had found exactly where he belonged.